like to acknowledge that I am on Burramadigal land. I'm a settler woman who lives on Gadigal land, and I do pay my respects to Aboriginal people here tonight, as well as to the elders, past, present and future. And once in my early 20s, I was living in Harris Park, and it was a miserable, wet, wintry night, and I was coming home from work. And at the time, I ran an NGO in Campbelltown called Nananagal Camps. And the parent body was a group of religious women known as the Presentation Sisters. I worked with disadvantaged and abused children in the housing estates. And as I checked my letterbox, I heard my name, Ruth, Ruth. And pronounced that way, it had to be a refugee. And it was. An Afghani woman from the block of flats next door. Clearly distressed, she gestured me to follow, and grudgingly I did so. In her small flat, there was her young adult daughter, and not much else. In the empty kitchen, a chopping board, a tiny penknife, and a bag of onions. And I want to weep every time I remember it. And they were both so sick. On their bridging visas, they could afford nothing. No doctor, no medicine, no furniture. Nothing to eat but raw brown onions. Nothing to cut them with but a tiny penknife with a handle the colour of pearls. I went home and I told my housemate, an 18-year-old Sierra Leonese asylum seeker. He got a cardboard box, he went to our kitchen, and he took half of everything from every drawer and cupboard and from the fridge. And I'd been walking lots of places as I didn't have petrol money, and he earned $10 an hour in a factory. And that story is hard to tell because of the pitiful state, and it's hard to call it anything else, although I don't like pity. It belittles the other person. But the pitiful state of those two women who walked out of Afghanistan over the mountains and lost two brothers, sons, along the way, and met such small hospitality here. And it's hard to tell because the young Sierra Leonese man wasn't allowed to stay. His generosity, despite the atrocities he had seen, surpassed that of most people I know, including my own. He made room for everyone, and we made no room for him. We sent him away suicidal with despair. It puts me in mind of an Islamic hadith Qudsi, which is a tradition of moral guidance for Muslims. And this one speaks directly to what I believe. Sahih Muslim, 1 of 1172. Allah's apostle said, "Verily Allah, the exalted and glorious, will say on the day of resurrection, O son of Adam, I was sick, but you did not visit me. He will say, O my Lord, how could I visit you when you are the Lord of the worlds? He will say, didn't you know that a certain servant of mine was sick, but you did not visit him? And were you not aware that if you had visited him, you would have found me by him? I asked you for food, but you did not feed me. He will say, my Lord, how could I feed you when you are the Lord of the worlds? And he will say, didn't you know that a certain servant of mine asked for food, but you did not feed him? And were you not aware that if you had fed him, you would have found him by my side? And the Lord will again say, O son of Adam, I asked you for something to drink, but you did not provide me with any. He will say, my Lord, how could I provide you with something to drink when you are the Lord of the worlds? He will say, a servant of mine asked you for a drink, but you did not provide one, and had you provided him with a drink, you would have found him near me. Each of us have those moments, don't we? And the simple truth of an injustice stares us in the face, asking for our compassion and our mercy. And each of us must face ourselves and our Creator in those moments, and when we reflect on them, sometimes for years afterwards. How did you respond? When your name was called, what did you do? And the context for that moment was that I was living in community, in Josephite Community Aid, JCA. It was an organisation that supported refugees and asylum seekers, amongst other things, and that has had lifelong repercussions. My decision as an 18-year-old to volunteer in Sydney with JCA, one of which is getting roped in here tonight. So be careful what you say yes to, because the consequences can echo all down the years. And the mission booklet of JCA was small, short, and to the point. JCA was about action, not talking, nor about wasting paper. And on the back was the quotation attributed to the Murray artist and activist Lilla Watson. "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Living alongside asylum seekers gave me a very strong sense that my liberation is indeed bound up with theirs, and with any others who are persecuted, human or environmental. Life for me is most strongly and satisfyingly lived in the margins, not in the centre. And this led somehow in my mid-20s to deciding that I needed to see for myself where refugees came from, so to speak. I needed to feel for myself something of what it was like. And so I ended up in northern Uganda, during the war between the Ugandan government and the Lord's Resistance Army. This civil war had been going on for 20 years, and the local population had been terrorised by both sides. The LRA were notorious for abducting children into the army and for brutal atrocities. For example, after abducting children, they would force them to kill their families so they could never go home again. The then head of the United Nations described it as the worst humanitarian disaster on earth at the time. And I said, see something of what it was like, because the privilege of my background meant that I could have decided it was too dangerous. I could have left northern Uganda and been welcomed in Australia. I would not have been punished for leaving, and in fact, most of my family and friends would have been quite pleased. It's only the people that we don't know in those wars that we punish for leaving. And I'm change-oriented. Mary MacKillop, in my opinion, has it right when she said, "Never see a need without doing something about it." And that's not a bad thing. And if you're a change agent too, you could well be sitting here thinking, of course seeing needs and doing something, like Mary MacKillop said, is not a bad thing. And when I say change agent, I mean a whole continuum of action. Maybe you run the UN. Maybe you greet a Muslim woman on the bus so that she knows not to be scared. Maybe you volunteer for a homework club. Maybe you donate money to an environmental cause. Just don't walk past injustice. Don't leave people or environments in need when you could help. But it can be problematic too. It can lead to burnout, for one thing, or to giving up. I can't solve the big problems of our age. I can't solve the small problems. Has anyone here tried to refuse a plastic straw every time they're offered? Even that's exhausting. That's not quite my point here, though it is important to not reach further than you can. I've learned to take better care of myself in my 30s. And the point I'm making right now is that I have had to learn about waiting without an answer. You know what it's like sitting with anxiety, sitting with uncertainty. It is anxiety-provoking, right? It's restless, it's uncomfortable. This letting go stuff, yeah, it's hard. I felt this a lot in northern Uganda. As a white person, I obviously represented the history of colonisation in that place. I symbolised the very problems of colonisation that had led to the black person in front of me leading a life that was very hard and very dangerous. They were at risk of re-abduction into the LRA. They were at risk of starvation, death from a myriad preventable diseases. They were often quite angry with me, and that was quite reasonable. As an example, I had a young man in my drama group threaten to kill me. I had just been in a bus accident and had shown up to the group still covered in blood and dust. I was more than a little shaken and grateful to have discovered a samosa in my pocket. So to have a teenage male threaten to kill me, standing in front of me full of his own physical power, seemed like the icing on the cake. I wanted to get mad at him. I wanted to chuck a tantrum and go home. I wanted to say, it's not fair, I'm trying to help. But I didn't. Somehow, something in me prompted me to stay calm and quiet. And it wasn't fear, and to ask, why do you want to kill me? Because, he said, when the LRA abduct me again, they will make me kill the people that I love. Was it the still small voice that the prophet Elijah heard after the fire that prompted me to be patient and calm? I don't know. Do you ever know? Elijah in the Bible expected God to be in the fury and the noise. I expected the meaning to be in the teenager's fury and his threats. But to Elijah's surprise, there was God in the unexpected moment of the gentle breeze, in the stillness and the calm after the storm and the fire. To my surprise, the meaning of the young man's threat came to me in the stillness and the calm that allowed me to reflect on what he had said. When that young man threatened to kill me, through the stillness and the calm, I was able to eventually hear what he was saying. That anger was fear. I had somehow made it into the group of people in his life that he loved and cared for. If he was re-abducted, he would be forced to kill me. And have you had that still, small voice speak to you? How did you respond? I certainly didn't always respond quietly. Once when 6 soldiers pointed their automatic weapons at me and threatened to kill me, right after I'd had a motorbike accident, and back in Australia, my psychology honours graduation was taking place and I was feeling very sorry for myself. I certainly wasn't still and quiet. I yelled at them in 3 languages until they sheepishly put their guns down. And after that, the soldiers in town treated me with a lot more respect. And that teenager, he now works for the United Nations in Mogadishu, in Somalia. From little things, big things grow. And the actions of kindness that you take now, you may never see the fruit. Or it may quietly contact you 10 years later so you can chat on WhatsApp. A lot of the work I did in northern Uganda over 2 years involved just sitting and listening. I have learnt that out on the margins, it is better to sit quietly and listen. When I come charging in from the centre with my ideas about how to help, I am invariably wrong. You might have heard the words subsidiarity and participation applied to the human story, and they're big words, and I probably haven't pronounced subsidiarity correctly. I might have. But they are concepts that are central to Catholic social teaching. Without getting caught up in the details of Catholic social teaching, subsidiarity and participation are attempts to name relevant principles for human liberation and dignity. These words basically insist that the people most affected by a problem need to be integrally involved in decisions about how to move forward. In the context of northern Uganda, my role, as I saw it, was about supporting community members to make their own decisions about healing from the traumas of war. And of course, I made mistakes in doing this. Once there in Kitgum, I went on a mission to get more girls into the drama group. I got several involved, and there was always this wall between us. There was this barrier that I couldn't identify nor penetrate, and I blamed them. Sulky, rude, adolescent girls. And after a particularly disastrous afternoon, a couple of the boys very generously and with huge courage, deputised by the girls, finally sat me down and gave me a talking to. The girls, by attending my group, were getting beaten at home. Every time they came, they got beaten afterwards by their fathers or uncles. So those girls that I had blamed for my poor relationship with them were so committed to the principles of their drama group that they were suffering physical violence in order to come. I felt so ashamed of myself. Once that was resolved, one consequence of the situation was that they started confiding in me about all of the men in their lives who were raping them. I was powerless. I tried, but it was a systemic problem that was beyond me. I could not protect them. I could not honour the stories they were bringing to me. There was no action I could take to help. I could change nothing. When you align with the margins, when you finally lean in close and listen, you cannot help but love. You cannot help but care. And sometimes in doing that, you get damaged. It is important to protect yourself, especially if you want to be involved in justice work in the long term and not get burnt out. But you cannot help but be transformed. To align with marginalised voices, human and ecological, is to be transformed. And transformation is painful, every time. To return to the hadith that I quoted, I was astounded the first time I read that. I knew it so intimately already. It's the Gospel of JCA, where I lived and grew with refugees. You know it, right? It's the Gospel of Matthew. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. We don't have the monopoly on that idea. In fact, the people that we often fear and hate have that idea too. How strange that we have something so key to our faith in common. And how much more do we share in common than we are blinded to by our fear? Imagine what we would learn if we opened up to faith instead of closing down in response to fear. Lean in. Lean in and listen. Journey regularly to the boundary of who you are and meet the other, the stranger, out beyond what you know and beyond where you feel safe. If you have faith, then you don't need to stay in the center where you feel safe. Journey to the margins. God is there. Goodness is there. Lean in and listen. To the refugee seeking asylum, the Aboriginal person explaining that there was genocide here, the transgender youth whose life depends on acceptance, the scientist telling you climate change is real, the creatures of the earth, air, and sea who need us to be better. Listen to the still small voice on the mountaintop. Thank you.